The year is 1231 AD. One of the most terrifying war machines the medieval world had ever seen is moving south. They have already shattered the Jin war machine. They have already erased the Khwarezmid Empire from the face of the earth. They have already sent terror from Beijing to the gates of Persia. Wherever the Mongol Horde moves, the world either bends the knee or risks annihilation. Now they are here, in Korea. General Sartaq, a senior commander in the Mongol Empire, crosses the Yalu River in August 1231 AD at the head of a force that dwarfs anything the Korean kingdom of Goryeo has ever faced. Town after town, fortress after fortress, falls before him. The northern border of Goryeo collapses like paper in the rain. His cavalry rides hard and fast, and nothing stands in his way. Nothing until Kuju, a fortress city, ancient walls. And inside those walls, a Korean general named Park Seo with a garrison so small, so outnumbered, that by every law of war and logic he should simply open the gates and save what lives he can. He does not open the gates. For 30 days straight, Sartaq unleashes the full fury of the Mongol war machine against those walls. Catapults, assault towers, fire carts, tunnels dug under the foundations, and what historical sources describe as the most horrifying weapon in the Mongol arsenal. Firebombs made with rendered fat from human remains. Hundreds of assaults. Hundreds. The walls are struck again and again until the fortress is swallowed by fire and smoke. Park Seo does not yield, and when it is all over, when the dust of a month of hell finally settles, it is not the Korean general who breaks. It is the Mongols who turn around and walk away. A few hundred core defenders. A Mongol force counted by some traditions in the tens of thousands, and one of the most extraordinary defensive stands in the history of human warfare. This is the Siege of Kuju, and this is the brutal truth. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who believes these stories deserve to be told, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Wars in History, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And drop a comment below, tell us, have you ever heard of General Park Seo before today? Because if you haven't, that is exactly why this channel exists. To see why what happened at Kuju in 1231 AD is so staggering, so almost impossible to believe, you first need to know who the Mongols were and what they had already done to the world. The Mongol Empire, forged on the war-torn steppes of Central Asia by Genghis Khan in 1206 AD, was not simply a large army. It was a system of destruction so efficient, so ruthlessly optimized, that military historians still struggle to find a parallel in all of recorded history. Genghis Khan unified the fractious Mongol and allied steppe tribes through a combination of battlefield brilliance, savage loyalty, and a willingness to annihilate those who refused to submit. He then turned this engine outward onto the world. The Jin dynasty of northern China, a massive, wealthy empire, was gravely wounded in 1215 AD, when Genghis took their capital at Zhongdu, the city we now call Beijing. The Kara Kitai crumbled by 1217 AD. The Khwarezmid Empire, a Muslim superpower stretching from Iran to Afghanistan, was erased from the map by 1221 AD. Entire cities were depopulated. Entire civilizations were set back by centuries. Genghis died in 1227 AD, but the machine he built did not slow. His son and successor, Ogedai Khan, formally recognized as the new Great Khan in 1229 AD, inherited both the empire and the appetite for conquest. The remaining Jin resistance was crushed by 1234 AD. The Mongol military at this point was a tested, battle-hardened, multi-ethnic force that incorporated the finest siege engineers from conquered Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian civilizations. They no longer fought only as cavalry on open plains. They had learned to shatter city walls and crack open fortress gates. They had made themselves seem unstoppable across almost every type of warfare. The kingdom of Goryeo, the Korean state that had ruled the peninsula since 918 AD, watched all of this from across the Yalu River. The Goryeo court was not naive. They understood what they were looking at. They had already faced and survived the Khitan Liao invasions of 993, 1010, and 1018 AD, and in the last of those campaigns, they had destroyed a 100,000-strong Khitan army in the mountains of what is now North Korea. Goryeo was a kingdom built on war. Its military aristocracy was battle-tested, and its generals understood the peninsula's geography better than any invader ever could. Broad rivers guarded the northern borders, Fortified mountain ranges divided the route south. The land itself was a weapon, and Goryeo's defenders knew how to use it. But the Mongols were not the Khitans. They were something new, something without precedent. Relations between Goryeo and the Mongols had been uneasy since 1219 AD, when the two powers had briefly allied to destroy a pillaging army of Khitan refugees. For a time, there was peace, fragile and transactional, but peace. Then in 1224 AD, a Mongol envoy arrived at the Goryeo capital of Kaesong and demanded tribute. Choi Yu, Goryeo's powerful military dictator who ruled in the king's name, refused. The envoy departed, and then the envoy was killed by bandits on his way home. The Mongols did not accept this as misfortune. They called it treachery, and they used it as the justification for everything that was about to follow. In August 1231 AD, General Sartaq crossed the Yalu River. The first Mongol invasion of Korea had begun. Town after town on the northern frontier fell with terrifying speed. The border fortresses, the outer ring of Goryeo's defences, were overrun. Sartaq's army moved fast, the way Mongol armies always moved, using speed as a psychological weapon as much as a military one. Resistance in the north collapsed, the capital at Kaesong trembled, and then the Mongol advance came to a place called Kuju, modern-day Kaesong in what is now North Korea. A fortress city, thick walls, a determined garrison, and a commander named Park Seo who had no intention whatsoever of letting the Mongols pass. What happened at those walls over the next 30 days would test every part of the Mongol war machine. The catapults would come forward, the assault towers would roll toward the ramparts, the sappers would dig beneath the foundations, fire would be hurled over the walls, and every time Sartaq tried to solve the problem of Kuju with another tool of conquest, Park Seo would answer with a countermeasure of his own. By the end, the question would no longer be whether Kuju could survive one more assault. The question would be how long the Mongols could keep paying the price of trying. What Park Seo did inside those walls, with a fraction of the manpower, a fraction of the resources, and a fraction of any reasonable hope, is the subject of this film. It is a story of engineering genius against overwhelming numbers. It is a story of fire and iron and stubborn, terrifying human will. It is a story about what happens when a small number of people refuse to accept the verdict that history has written for them. This is where the avalanche of the Horde finally met the wall it could not break. To understand the full weight of what General Park Seo faced when the Mongol army appeared on the horizon outside Kuju in the autumn of 1231 AD, you cannot simply count the soldiers. You have to understand what the Mongol Empire was, what it meant, what it represented, and what it had already done to the world before it ever set foot on Korean soil. Because the Mongols were not simply an enemy. By 1231 AD, the Mongols seemed like the closest thing the medieval world had ever produced to an unstoppable force of nature, and the kingdom of Goryeo, ancient, proud, and militarily accomplished, was about to feel the full weight of that force against its walls. The Mongol Empire had been forged through war and conquest on the steppes of Central Asia by Temujin, the man history knows as Genghis Khan, who unified the warring Mongol tribes under a single iron fist and proclaimed his empire in 1206 AD. What made the Mongols so terrifying was not simply their cavalry, though the Mongol horse archer, capable of firing accurately at full gallop in any direction, was the deadliest individual soldier of the medieval age. It was their system. Genghis Khan built a military apparatus of terrifying sophistication and adaptability. Promotions were based on merit, not birth. Subordinates who showed loyalty and brilliance rose quickly. The army was organized into units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, the famous Tumen, with a command and control structure that could operate independently across hundreds of miles of battlefield. Intelligence networks reported on enemy dispositions before a campaign even began. Diplomacy was used as a weapon: surrender and be spared, resist and be annihilated. These were not empty words. Genghis Khan made them real, repeatedly, visibly, and on a scale that sent shockwaves of terror rolling across continents ahead of his armies, like a bow wave before a ship. The Jin dynasty of northern China, one of the most powerful states in East Asia, had stood for over a century before the Mongols arrived. It commanded vast armies, enormous cities, and sophisticated defences. The Mongols first broke its outer walls in 1211 AD and spent the next 2 decades systematically dismantling it, By 1215 AD, Zhongdu, the Jin capital, the city we now call Beijing, had fallen. Vast numbers perished. The survivors fled south. The Jin never recovered, and the dynasty itself was extinguished in 1234 AD. The Khwarezmid Empire to the west, a Muslim superpower stretching from modern Iran to Afghanistan, a state of enormous wealth and military power that its own Shah had arrogantly dismissed the Mongols as beneath his concern, lasted barely 4 years against Genghis Khan's campaign. Between 1219 and 1221 AD, cities that had stood for centuries were erased: Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur, Merv. The population of Merv alone was reported to have numbered in the millions before the Mongols arrived. Afterward, it was rubble and silence. These were not simply military defeats, they were civilizational extinctions. The Mongols were sending a message to every kingdom on earth: there is no wall high enough, no army large enough, no wealth rich enough to protect you if you choose resistance. Genghis Khan died in 1227 AD. His empire did not. His son Ogadai Khan was confirmed as Great Khan at a grand assembly called a Kurultai in 1229 AD, and immediately set the war machine back in motion. The remaining Jin resistance was crushed by 1234 AD. The Mongols absorbed the engineers, the siege specialists, the doctors, the scholars, and the administrators of every civilization they defeated. They did not simply conquer territories, they metabolized them. And so, by 1231 AD, when Ogadai Khan turned his attention to the Korean Peninsula, the Mongol military was not the same force that had once been a confederation of steppe nomads. It was a composite, adaptive, terrifyingly capable army that could fight and win in mountains, across rivers, in the depths of winter, and behind the walls of the most fortified cities in the world. The kingdom of Goryeo had watched all of this from across the Yalu River with growing dread. Goryeo was no innocent, it was itself a state forged in warfare. It had been established in 918 AED by the military commander Wang Geon, who unified the warring Korean kingdoms after a period of fragmentation following the fall of the ancient Silla dynasty. Goryeo, from whose name the word Korea itself derives, had spent over 3 centuries building a sophisticated civilization. It produced fine ceramics, advanced printing technology, a rich Buddhist culture, and a military aristocracy of genuine competence. Its generals had fought and won against major invasions before. Between 993 and 1018 AD, the kingdom had faced 3 successive invasions by the Khitan Liao Empire, a major steppe power. In the final and most dangerous of those campaigns, in 1018 AD, the Korean general Gang Gamchan had ambushed and annihilated the Khitan army of over 100,000 men during their retreat along the Chongchon River. It was one of the most complete military victories in Korean history, and it had secured Goryeo's northern borders for 2 centuries. Goryeo knew how to fight. Its generals understood their terrain, and they had no intention of submitting to anyone. But the history of the Khitan invasions also carried a warning that the Goryeo court would have done well to heed more carefully in the years before 1231 AD. The Khitans, for all their power, had been defeated in part because they allowed their supply lines to overextend, their forces to scatter, and their momentum to stall against a people fighting on home ground, with interior lines and familiarity with the terrain. The Mongols had learned from the failures of every enemy they had ever defeated. They were not going to make the same mistakes. Relations between Goryeo and the Mongols had begun, strangely enough, in cooperation. In 1219 AD, a combined Mongol and Goryeo force had worked together to crush a marauding army of Khitan refugees who had fled into the Korean Peninsula and spent 2 years pillaging the northern provinces. After this joint operation, the Mongols imposed a tributary relationship on Goryeo, a demand for annual payments of goods and materials. For a time, Goryeo complied, however grudgingly. The court at Kaesong, the Goryeo capital, understood that the Mongols were dangerous neighbours, and that tribute was a price worth paying to avoid their attention. But as the years passed and the demands grew more humiliating and more onerous, resentment within the Goryeo court hardened into defiance. The real power in Goryeo at this time lay not with the king but with the military dictator Choe-Yu, who governed from behind the throne. Choe-Yu was a proud, stubborn man from a family that had controlled Goryeo's military politics for over 3 decades. He did not bend easily. and when in 1224 AD a Mongol envoy arrived with yet another set of tribute demands, seizing only the otter pelts from the presented goods and leaving the rest scattered in the fields as a deliberate insult, relations reached a breaking point. Then the envoy was killed on his way home. The circumstances remain disputed by historians. The Mongols called it murder and called it Goryeo's fault. Goryeo claimed it was bandits. It does not ultimately matter which version was true because the Mongols were not looking for justice. They were looking for justification. And now they had one. Diplomatic contact between the two states was severed in early 1225 AD. For 6 years, the Yalu River served as an uneasy border. Both sides knew what was coming. Goryeo prepared. But preparation and readiness are two different things, and no amount of preparation was truly adequate for what arrived in August 1231 AD. On the 26th of August, 1231 AD, the Mongol army under General Sartaq, known in Chinese records as Sartaq and in Korean sources as Saratai, crossed the Yalu River and entered Goryeo territory. Saratai was a senior commander in the Mongol army, a veteran of multiple campaigns, trusted by Ogadai Khan to execute what was intended to be a swift, decisive subjugation of the Korean Peninsula. He brought with him a force of substantial size. Estimates vary in the historical sources, but the army was large enough to simultaneously split into multiple columns and attack different parts of the Goryeo frontier at once. This was a classic Mongol operational approach: divide the enemy's attention, overload his capacity to respond, prevent any single point of concentration, and use speed to stay ahead of any coherent defense. The results in the opening weeks of the invasion were catastrophic for Goryeo. The northernmost frontier fortress of Hamsin-chin at Uiju fell almost immediately when its commander, Defense General Cho Suk-chang, and his deputy Chon Khan surrendered without meaningful resistance. The Mongols split their forces, one column swinging north to strike Sakju while the main body pressed south down the Yalu toward Cheongju. At Cholchu, in what is now Hamgyong province, the situation became one of the most harrowing episodes of the entire invasion. Faced with the approaching Mongol force, the defenders destroyed their stores and the town became a symbol of how desperate resistance had become. This was not cowardice. It was the terrible logic of people who had heard what the Mongols did to those who resisted and understood that capture could be worse than death. Town after town fell. Inju submitted when a Goryeo warlord named Hong Pok Won defected to the Mongols entirely, taking 1,500 households with him. This was a particularly damaging blow. Hong knew the peninsula intimately, and his family would go on to serve as guides for the Mongols across multiple subsequent invasions. His defection illustrated something the Goryeo court had to grapple with throughout this crisis. Not everyone in the kingdom was willing to die for a political system that was itself deeply unjust, governed by an unelected military dictator who ruled a king little more than a figurehead. The society Goryeo's soldiers were asked to die defending was one in which power was concentrated in the hands of a very few. For many common people, Mongol conquest held no more terror than the existing hierarchy. This internal fracture would haunt Goryeo for the entire duration of the Mongol Wars. Yongju, Sonju and Kwakchu all fell in October 1231 AD. Saratam bypassed Chaju and the western capital of Pyongyang, where he encountered stiffer resistance, and pressed southward with his main force. His objective was clear: reach the capital at Kaesong, force Goryeo's submission, and end the campaign before winter tightened its grip on the peninsula. Speed was his weapon. Every day the Mongol army moved faster than the Goryeo court could respond to. The psychological pressure on the king and Choi Yu intensified. The Goryeo three armies, the kingdom's main military force, were mobilized and marched north in early October under the command of Yi Cha-song. They managed to beat back a surprise attack by 8,000 Mongol soldiers, but were then defeated at Anju, a reverse that shook Goryeo's confidence in its ability to face the Mongols in open field battle. The lesson was being written in blood. Against the Mongols on open ground, Korean armies struggled. Their advantages lay elsewhere, in their knowledge of the terrain, in their fortified mountain cities, and in the stubbornness of individual commanders willing to hold their ground even when all logic said otherwise. The Mongols swept around and beyond these holdouts and reached Chabi Pass, the gateway to Kaesong itself. The capital was now within striking distance. Goryeo began emergency negotiations. But even as diplomacy started, individual fortress commanders across the invaded territory received no orders to stand down, and some of them, either through defiance, delay, or deliberate choice, kept their gates shut and their defenders at the walls. One of those fortress commanders was Park Seo at Kuju. Kuju, in modern geography corresponding to the area around Kusong in what is now North Korea, sat astride one of the critical routes through the northwest of the peninsula. It was a fortress city, meaning it was not simply a military installation but a walled urban centre with a population, with granaries, with infrastructure, and with walls built to resist siege. Park Seo was the military commander responsible for its defence, and by the time the Mongol noose was tightening around northern Goryeo in the autumn of 1231 AD, a number of Korean soldiers and officers from surrounding, already fallen towns had found their way to Kuju's gates and joined his garrison. This included Kim Chungon, who would defend the eastern and western walls, and Kim Kyongsun, who had originally tried to fight the Mongols at Cheongju before retreating to Kuju, and who now took responsibility for the southern wall. The force assembled under Park Seo's command was a fraction, a desperately small fraction, of what Sartaq was bringing against them. The numbers recorded in historical sources are striking in their disparity. Korean traditional accounts emphasize the overwhelming imbalance, some 300 core defenders holding a fortress against a Mongol force that numbered in the tens of thousands. Even accounting for the typical tendency of historical sources to dramatize numerical disparity, the gap was real and enormous. Sartaq had already swept aside everything Goryeo had placed in his path. He had crushed border fortresses, bypassed mountain strongholds, scattered the three armies in the field, and put Goryeo's capital under threat. His army was at the absolute peak of its operational momentum. His soldiers were tested veterans of campaigns across the breadth of Asia. His siege train, the Mongols' inherited arsenal of Chinese and Central Asian engineering, was capable of reducing stone walls to rubble. And Park Seo shut the gates. There are moments in history that seem, from the comfortable distance of 800 years, to defy explanation by ordinary human psychology. Men and women do things that no rational calculation of survival probability would recommend. Sometimes it is fanaticism, sometimes it is despair so complete that death in battle seems preferable to any other outcome, sometimes it is pure ideology, and sometimes, rarely but genuinely, it is something that can only be called courage in its most elemental and unrefined form. Park Seo's decision to hold Kuju is almost certainly some mixture of all of these things. He was a military commander. He had an obligation to resist. He had soldiers who were looking to him for leadership. He had a fortress that, if properly defended, presented genuine obstacles even to the Mongols. And perhaps, he had calculated something that the Mongol generals had not. That time and attrition and terrain and will could do things that numbers alone could not. Sartaq sent his forces against Kuju, and what happened next would force him to recalculate everything. Before we move on to Act 2 and the moment the Mongol war machines are wheeled into position, a quick word. This channel, Wars in History, exists because of your support. We put serious research and serious production into every single episode we make, and the best way you can keep that going is by using NordVPN. We do not just wave a sponsor name at you and move on. We genuinely use it. When you are deep diving historical research, accessing archives and academic sources from around the world, a reliable, fast and private connection matters. NordVPN gives you that, across multiple devices, with one of the fastest and most trusted networks available. If you want to support this channel in a real direct way, head to the link in the description and pick up a NordVPN subscription. It costs you very little. It means everything to us. And now, back to the walls of Kuju, where the Mongol engineers are just getting started. There is a moment in every siege, a moment that comes before the first stone is thrown, before the first gate is struck, before the first ladder goes up against a wall, when both sides take stock of each other across the open ground between them. The attackers look at the walls and calculate how thick, how high, how many defenders on the ramparts, how many gates, how many weak points in the foundations, how many angles from which to press simultaneously. The defenders look out from the walls and calculate in return. How many men, how many machines, how wide the formation, how far back the supply train, how much time before the first assault begins. This mutual assessment happens in silence, and in that silence, the real battle, the battle of minds, of engineering, of operational planning, begins before a single weapon is raised. Sartaq looked at the walls of Kuju and saw an obstacle, not an insurmountable one. In the course of his career in the Mongol army, Sartaq had seen walls far more formidable than these fall to the disciplined application of Mongol siege doctrine. He had at his disposal the finest siege apparatus in the world at that time, an arsenal assembled across decades of conquest from the technical knowledge of Chinese, Persian, Eurasian and Central Asian military engineers, all of it refined through campaigns against some of the most heavily fortified cities on earth. The walls of Kuju were serious, the defenders were committed, but Sartaq had broken committed defenders before. He had the tools, he had the manpower, he had the expertise, and he had all the time he needed. What Sartaq did not fully appreciate yet, what would only become clear over 30 brutal days, was that on the other side of those walls was a man who had prepared for exactly this moment. Park Seo was not simply a soldier, he was a thinking soldier, which in the age of medieval siege warfare was a fundamentally different kind of commander. A soldier fights. A thinking soldier asks why he is fighting, what the terrain is doing for or against him, what the enemy's doctrine requires, and how to turn the enemy's strengths into vulnerabilities. Park Seo understood Mongol siege doctrine well enough to know what was coming. The Mongols did not improvise sieges. They had a system, a proven battle-tested system of escalating pressure designed to exhaust defenders psychologically and physically while their engineers dismantled the walls around them. Park Seo's task was not to fight the Mongols. His task was to break their system. And to do that, he had to understand every component of that system more deeply than many of the men who were about to deploy it against him. The Mongol siege system in 1231 AD was the product of over 2 decades of campaigning against fortified cities across Asia. When Genghis Khan had first turned the Mongol army against walled cities in northern China after 1211 AD, he had faced a fundamental problem. His cavalry, however brilliant in the open field, could not simply ride over stone walls. The early Mongol sieges were costly and slow, relying on blockade and starvation rather than direct assault. But Genghis Khan was nothing if not adaptive, and as the Mongols absorbed conquered peoples into their imperial system, they absorbed their knowledge too. Chinese military engineers brought with them centuries of accumulated expertise in siegecraft. The design and operation of traction trebuchets, counterweight catapults, ballistas, and a range of specialized devices for projecting stones, fire, and toxic compounds over or through walls. Persian and Central Asian engineers added their own traditions, particularly around the construction of large wooden siege towers, massive rolling platforms that could be pushed up against walls to allow assault troops to fight on equal footing with defenders on the ramparts. By the time the Mongol war machine reached Korea in 1231 AD, it carried with it engineering knowledge drawn from half a dozen civilizations, and the men who operated that machinery were skilled professionals who had practiced their craft against the walls of major cities from Beijing to Samarkand. The Mongol approach to a siege followed a recognizable sequence that any defender with intelligence and foresight could study and anticipate. First, the surrounding. The Mongol army would encircle the target completely, cutting off all supply lines and communications, preventing any relief force from reaching the garrison and any messenger from leaving to call for help. This isolation was critical. A fortress whose garrison knew that relief was coming could hold out almost indefinitely on willpower alone. A fortress whose defenders understood that they were entirely alone, that no army was marching to their rescue, that each day that passed was one day closer to starvation or exhaustion without any external salvation. That fortress was already half broken psychologically before the engineers even unlimbered their machines. Second, the preparation of the siege lines. The Mongols were experienced at constructing field fortifications around besieged cities, earthworks, trenches, protective screens that shielded their engineers and assault troops from sorties by the defenders while they worked to bring their siege equipment into position. Third, the technical assault. This was where the engineers took centre stage. Catapults would be established at calculated distances from the walls, far enough to be out of direct small arms range, close enough to land stones on the walls and ramparts with accuracy. The trebuchet, which used a heavy counterweight to generate enormous throwing force, could hurl stones weighing 50 to 100 kilograms over distances of up to 300 meters with sufficient accuracy to repeatedly strike the same section of wall, gradually weakening it. Over days and weeks of continuous bombardment, even the most solidly constructed stone walls could be cracked, displaced, or partially collapsed. Fourth, the assault. Once walls had been damaged and defenders worn down by sleeplessness and continuous bombardment, assault towers were pushed forward and infantry advanced under covering fire to attempt to breach or scale the walls. Fifth, if all else failed, the tunnel. Mongol engineers were practiced at identifying the soil and foundation conditions beneath a fortified wall and directing teams of specialized sappers to tunnel underneath, shoring the tunnel as they advanced, then packing the end of the tunnel with combustible material, setting it alight and retreating. When the shoring burned away, the tunnel collapsed, and the section of wall above it subsided, sometimes catastrophically. This was the machine that came to rest outside the walls of Kuju in the autumn of 1231 AD. Sartaq ordered the encirclement of the fortress. No messenger in, no messenger out. No supply convoy would reach Park Seo. No relief army, not that the remnants of Goryeo's shattered field forces were in any condition to organise one, would break through the Mongol screen around the city. Then his engineers began their work. The catapult line went up first. Mongol engineering crews had long practice at selecting ground, calculating range, and establishing overlapping fields of fire that allowed multiple machines to saturate a given section of wall simultaneously. The stones they used were not random. Experienced operators knew that the most effective approach was to concentrate fire on specific points: the base of a tower, a section of wall between two projecting bastions, the area around a gate, rather than spreading impact across the entire circuit. Concentrated fire on a single point created cumulative damage that dispersed fire never could. Sartaq's engineers were good at this. They had done it before. They ranged their machines, calibrated their counterweights, and began to throw. The sound of a medieval trebuchet bombardment is something that defies easy description to a modern ear accustomed to the sharp crack of firearms. The trebuchet does not crack, it groans, a deep hydraulic groan of massive timbers under enormous tension, and then it releases with a sound that is more felt than heard, a percussive thud of the throwing arm against its stop that sends a shockwave through the ground itself. And then, seconds later, the impact of the stone against the wall, not a crack but a hammering, grinding, concussive boom that sends chips and fragments of stone spraying inward and vibrates the entire wall section like a struck bell. For a defender standing on those walls, this sound, repeated dozens of times per day, hour after hour for days on end, is not simply frightening. It is physically and psychologically exhausting in ways that are difficult to fully convey. The ground shakes, the walls tremble, dust and stone fragments fill the air. The noise is inescapable. Sleep becomes nearly impossible. The body responds to continuous explosive sound with a sustained adrenal state that is enormously taxing. Muscles tighten, the heart races, reaction times sharpen, briefly but then dull as exhaustion accumulates. After 3 days of this, a defender's hands shake even when no stone is falling. After a week, men begin to make mistakes. This was exactly what Sartaq intended. But Park Seo had prepared for this, and his response to the opening bombardment revealed the quality of his military mind. A defensive genius, and the historical record, sparse as it is, consistently characterizes Park Seo in exactly these terms, does not simply absorb punishment and hope the walls hold. He fights the siege actively. He turns the defender's natural advantages, interior lines, knowledge of the terrain, prepared positions, and the ability to concentrate forces at any threatened point without having to cross open ground, into weapons. Park Seo organized his garrison not as a static force distributed evenly along the walls, but as a dynamic, reactive system capable of responding to threats wherever they emerged. The most experienced soldiers were positioned at the points of greatest structural vulnerability: the gates, the wall sections nearest to the catapult concentration, the tower positions that commanded the approaches most likely to be used by assault formations. Reserves were held back from the walls and positioned centrally, where they could be fed rapidly to any section that came under particular pressure. This sounds obvious in retrospect. But in the chaos of continuous bombardment, with sections of wall being struck repeatedly and smoke and dust obscuring visibility, maintaining the discipline to hold reserves back rather than committing them piecemeal, as each new crisis erupted required exactly the kind of Iron Command presence that Park Seo appears to have possessed. He also fought back against the catapults. This is a detail that separates a passive defender from an active one. The catapult positions outside the walls were not invulnerable. They required constant maintenance. Ropes frayed under the enormous tension of repeated use. Counterweights had to be adjusted, throwing arms cracked and had to be replaced. A sufficiently aggressive sortie. A small force of fast-moving soldiers who broke through or around the Mongol screen, fell on the catapult crews and their machinery, inflicted maximum damage in minimum time, and then withdrew before the Mongol reaction could envelop them, could damage or destroy individual machines, disrupt the siege rhythm, and impose casualties on the engineering crews that were not easily replaced. There is evidence in the historical record of the Goryeo defenders conducting exactly these kinds of active defensive measures throughout the siege, maintaining pressure on the besiegers even as the besiegers maintained pressure on the walls. The assault towers came next. The Mongol assault tower, known in Chinese military literature as a luche or tower cart, was one of the most formidable pieces of siege equipment in the medieval world. Built from heavy timbers and assembled on site by the Mongol engineering corps from prefabricated components carried in the supply train, a fully constructed assault tower could rise to 3 or 4 stories in height, tall enough to overtop the average fortification wall. The lower structure was mounted on large wooden wheels or log rollers that allowed dozens of men to push it forward across prepared ground. The sides were screened with wet hides to resist fire, and the interior contained multiple platforms connected by ladders, with a bridge or ramp at the top level that could be dropped onto an enemy wall to allow assault troops to rush directly from the tower onto the ramparts. A large tower could carry 50 to 100 assault infantry. Multiple towers advancing simultaneously against the same section of wall could deliver an overwhelming concentration of assault troops onto a relatively short stretch of rampart in a very short period of time, far faster than the defenders could reinforce that section from their reserves. Sartaq ordered the construction and forward deployment of these towers once the initial bombardment had, in his judgment, sufficiently weakened the selected wall sections and their defenders. Park Seo saw the towers being assembled, and now began what the historical sources characterize as a war of engineers, a battle not of strength against strength, but of ingenuity against ingenuity, preparation against preparation, problem against counter-solution. Park Seo's response to the towers was not to wait for them to reach the walls. He had prepared for them. The defenders had worked, in the period before the siege closed in, to prepare a range of defensive materials specifically designed to defeat assault towers and the troops they carried. Huge quantities of combustible material had been stored. Bundles of dried wood soaked in oil and other accelerants. Cauldrons had been positioned at key wall sections to heat materials that could be poured or thrown down from above. The stone-throwing equipment on the walls, lighter, more maneuverable than the Mongol trebuchets outside, but capable of high-angle fire that the flatter trajectory Mongol machines could not easily replicate, had been positioned not only to return fire against the catapult lines, but specifically to target the towers as they advanced. And Park Seo had thought carefully about the geometry of tower assault. A tower must approach from outside the walls, moving across open ground toward a specific section of wall. The defenders have the advantage of observation. They can see the tower coming well in advance. They can concentrate fire on it during its approach. They can prepare the wall section it is targeting. They can position countermeasures that activate at the moment the bridge drops. Park Seo used all of these advantages. The Mongol towers came forward under covering fire from the catapult line. The defenders on the walls responded with everything they had. Projectiles launched from the wall-top engines, volleys of arrows from massed archers using the height advantage of the ramparts to extend their range, and, most devastatingly, materials thrown or poured from above designed to burn or destroy the tower structure itself. The wet hides on the sides of the towers resisted fire reasonably well, but they could not protect the wheels, the rollers, the undercarriage, or the forward edge of the top-level assault bridge from a sustained, concentrated aerial bombardment from directly above. And as the towers drew close to the walls, the defenders were no longer throwing at them from the front. They were throwing at them from above, bypassing the protective screens entirely. Multiple towers were damaged. Some were destroyed before they could deliver their assault troops. The fighting at the wall top when a tower did manage to deploy its bridge was ferocious and bloody. Hand-to-hand combat of extreme violence on a narrow platform, with defenders who knew that the loss of any section of wall meant the loss of everything, fighting with the desperation that knowledge creates. And the Mongols did not break through. Not on the first day of tower assault, not on the 5th, not on the 10th. The walls of Kuju held, section by section, defender by defender, assault by assault. Sartaq watched from his command position and recalibrated. The towers were not enough. The catapults were not enough. He needed another approach. The sappers went to work. Tunneling under a fortification wall is one of the oldest and most technically demanding forms of siege engineering. The sapper, the mine specialist, had to identify a section of wall whose foundations were vulnerable to undermining, calculate the optimal approach angle to avoid detection by the defenders above, and then direct a team of diggers in the slow, dangerous, physically exhausting work of advancing a tunnel through the earth toward the wall foundations while supporting the tunnel overhead with timber shores to prevent collapse during the work. The tunnel had to be dug in silence, or as close to it as could be managed, because the defenders were actively listening. A sufficiently alert garrison would post men along the inside of the wall with their ears against the ground or against resonating vessels placed on the floor, bowls of water whose surface would ripple at the faint transmitted vibration of digging below. If the defenders detected the tunnel, they could dig a counter-tunnel from inside the walls, intercept the sappers underground, and flood the tunnel or fight the miners in the darkness below the earth, a form of combat so confined and terrifying that it has no real equivalent above ground. Or they could wait until the tunnel was nearly complete, and then deploy countermeasures from above, digging down to the tunnel line and pouring liquids or burning material in, collapsing sections of the approach, or concentrating defensive forces at the point above the tunnel, so that when the wall section above subsided, there were enough defenders already in position to seal the breach before the Mongol assault infantry could exploit it. Park Seo's garrison was listening. They found the tunnels, and they responded with a ferocity and effectiveness that stunned the Mongol engineers. The countermeasures used by the Kuju defenders against the Mongol sappers were recorded in the historical sources with enough specificity to understand their character. The defenders used heat, a weapon that could be deployed from above ground into the tunnel below. Molten iron, heated to liquid in the forges that had been prepared inside the fortress walls, was poured into the tunnel approaches. Burning material was forced down into the shafts. The effect on men working in a confined underground space, with no room to maneuver and no direction to run in, is too terrible to dwell on at length. The sappers died in their tunnels. The tunneling operations failed. Sartaq's engineers had encountered a defender who had not merely prepared for this contingency, but had prepared for it so thoroughly that their most technically demanding form of attack was neutralized. 30 days of this. And the Mongols had not broken through. Not one section of wall had been breached and held. Not one gate had been forced. Not one assault tower had delivered enough troops onto a Kuju rampart to create a lodgment that could not be thrown back. The catapult bombardment had continued without pause, inflicting casualties, damaging sections of wall, driving the garrison to the edge of physical endurance. But the walls were still standing, the gates were still closed, and Park Seo was still commanding from inside. The old Mongol general, 70 years of age, a veteran of campaigns stretching back to the early years of Genghis Khan's conquests, a man who had stood beneath the walls of more cities than he could count and watched them fall, came down to walk the ground beneath Kuju's walls sometime in those 30 days. He looked up at the ramparts and at the defenders still standing on them. He looked at the damage his army had inflicted, the pockmarked stone, the scorched timbers, the craters in the earth where stones had fallen and been cleared, and he said what the historical record preserved, that in all his years, in all his campaigns, in all the sieges he had witnessed and participated in, he had never seen a city absorb an assault like this one and still refuse to submit. He was almost certainly right. There is a particular quality to the silence that falls between assaults during a siege. It is not peace, it is not rest. It is the silence of two sides catching their breath, resetting their machines, counting their dead, and preparing to do it all again. For the Mongols outside the walls of Kuju in the autumn of 1231 AD, That silence between assaults was a working silence. Engineers re-rigging catapult arms, infantry commanders reorganizing assault formations, sapper teams being briefed on new tunnel approaches, officers calculating the geometry of the next attack. For the defenders on the walls, that same silence was a different kind of working silence, dragging the wounded away from the ramparts, clearing debris thrown up by stone impacts, restocking defensive materials at the wall positions, reinforcing cracked mortar with whatever could be found, and listening. Always listening. Because in siege warfare, the moment you stop listening, the moment you allow yourself to believe that the silence means anything other than preparation, is the moment the next assault catches you half ready. Park Seo did not allow his garrison to stop listening. Not for a single day. Not for a single night. This is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of what his garrison achieved at Kuju. Not simply the physical act of repelling assault after assault, but the maintenance of operational discipline and alertness across 30 consecutive days of hell. The human body was not designed for sustained siege conditions. Sleep deprivation accumulates. Hunger, if rations are tight, compounds exhaustion. The psychological weight of watching fellow soldiers die, of manning positions that have already been struck repeatedly by heavy projectiles, of knowing that no relief is coming and that the only outcome available to you is to hold or to die. This weight does not lighten with time, it grows heavier, and the men who crack first under a siege are not always the weakest or least experienced. Sometimes they are the most thoughtful, the ones who understand clearly enough to calculate the odds and arrive at a conclusion that despair wants them to accept. Park Seo's command presence, his ability to sustain the will of his garrison across a month of this, was itself a weapon. We do not have his speeches, we do not have his exact words to his men on the wall. The historical sources of the Goryeo period do not preserve commanders' addresses the way later military histories sometimes do. But we know the outcome, and the outcome is only explicable if we accept that what he communicated to his soldiers, through his actions, his positioning at points of danger, his refusal to show fear, his methodical preparation of countermeasure after countermeasure, was something that functioned as a bulwark against despair as much as his walls functioned as a bulwark against stone. The garrison of Kuju was not a suicide cult. They were soldiers who believed, because their commander's behaviour gave them reason to believe, that what they were doing was working, that each assault they defeated cost the Mongols something they could not easily recover, that the math of this siege was not as simple as tens of thousands outside the walls against a few hundred within them. And they were right. It was exactly that kind of calculation, cold, clear, strategic, that drove the specific defensive measures that make the Siege of Kuju one of the most remarkable episodes in the entire history of medieval warfare. Let us talk about fire. Fire in medieval warfare was not a single weapon. It was a category, a vast, varied and frighteningly creative category of destructive tools that military engineers on both sides of the walls at Kuju had developed, refined, and deployed in ways that a modern observer might find almost unimaginably brutal. The Mongols were, by 1231 AD, sophisticated users of incendiary weapons. Their siege train carried fire carts, heavy wooden-wheeled platforms loaded with burning combustible material that could be pushed against wooden gates to set them alight. Their catapults could throw not just stone but burning bundles of material, ceramic pots filled with flammable liquid that shattered on impact and spread fire across wall tops and into the structures within. And the most grotesque weapon in their entire arsenal, one that the historical sources mention specifically in connection with the Siege of Kuju, and that tells us something deeply disturbing about the lengths to which siege warfare could descend, were the firebombs filled with liquefied human fat. This weapon deserves to be understood in its full horror, because it tells us what the garrison of Kuju actually endured. Rendered fat burns with intense, sustained heat, and is extraordinarily difficult to extinguish once it contacts a surface. According to the chronicle tradition, the Mongols used this material in incendiary bombs not merely to damage walls, but to break the spirit of the defenders. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, a message that resistance would bring not just military pressure, but terror. The Mongols had used psychological terror across their campaigns in China and Central Asia, displaying extreme violence as a warning to anyone watching. At Kuju, they brought that tradition to bear against a garrison that simply refused to receive the message. When these burning bombs landed on or inside the walls of Kuju, they did not simply create fire, they created panic, or they were intended to. Burning liquids spreading across a wall top, igniting clothing and equipment, producing flames that water alone could not reliably extinguish. Doing all of this in the middle of an assault that had already broken the garrison's attention into a dozen simultaneous crises. This was a weapon designed to make the walls untenable, to make the defenders choose between staying at their posts and burning, or abandoning their post and losing the wall. It was a weapon designed to create exactly the moment of cascading failure that a simultaneous infantry assault could exploit. Park Seo had prepared countermeasures for fire too. The details of the defensive counterfire measures at Kuju are preserved with enough specificity in the historical record to reconstruct their broad outlines with reasonable confidence. The defenders had prepared large quantities of water and other fire suppression materials staged at intervals along the walls and available to be deployed rapidly wherever fire landed. But water alone was insufficient against the incendiary compounds the Mongols were using, and Park Seo knew this. The more sophisticated response involved the defenders' own use of heat as a weapon, turning the Mongols' fire-based tactics back against them, but with a precision and targeting that the Mongols' catapult-launched incendiaries could not match. Molten iron was the centerpiece of this counterfire doctrine, and its use at Kuju is one of the most remarkable examples of defensive weapons improvisation in medieval military history. The forges inside the fortress, which would normally have been used to produce and repair weapons and armour for the garrison, were dedicated instead to the continuous production of molten metal. Iron heated to its liquid state reaches temperatures well above 1,500 degrees Celsius. It flows, it penetrates, it ignites vulnerable material, wood, rope, fabric, and unprotected equipment with terrifying speed. And crucially, in the context of siege defence, it can be poured from above onto any target directly below the wall. An assault tower drawn up against the wall, with its forward assault bridge deployed and Mongol infantry crowded on its upper platforms waiting to rush across. This was a target that could not easily evade what was poured down on it from directly overhead. The wet hides that screened the sides of the assault towers gave protection against fire that came at the tower from an angle. They gave no protection against molten iron poured directly down from above. The iron ran through gaps in the screening, along the structural timbers of the tower, across the platforms where the assault infantry stood. The result was something that a historian can describe in clinical language, but that the soldiers who experienced it, on both sides of the wall, would have found almost incomprehensible in its violence. Assault formations broke. Tower crews were struck down at their machines. The towers themselves, their timber frameworks compromised by heat, became structural liabilities rather than assault platforms. This is what the historical sources mean when they describe the defenders using molten iron. It was not symbolic, it was not exaggerated, it was a systematically deployed defensive weapon of extraordinary effectiveness, deployed by a garrison that had prepared it in advance and maintained the forge capacity to produce it continuously across 30 days of siege. But the defenders of Kuju did not stop at molten iron. The burning mud, a second material specifically referenced in accounts of the siege, tells us something equally important about how Park Seo's garrison thought about their defensive arsenal. Mud, mixed with flammable material and heated to a sufficient temperature, becomes a heavy, viscous, burning compound that spreads on contact and is far more difficult to shake off than simple fire. Unlike water-based liquids that fall vertically, thickened burning compounds cling to surfaces and equipment. They are extraordinarily difficult to extinguish quickly. Poured from a wall top onto troops attempting to scale a ladder or storm a breach, this material created casualties in a way that was not simply physically damaging but operationally devastating. Soldiers hit with burning compounds could not maintain their position in an assault formation, could not hold weapons, could not climb. They became obstacles to the men behind them. A narrow breach or a ladder point that suddenly became choked with casualties and burning material was a breach or ladder point that could not deliver assault troops to the wall top in sufficient numbers to create a lodgment before the defenders could close in and drive them back. The Korean defenders also deployed anti-siege weaponry of a more conventional but no less effective kind. The crossbow, the sei-no in Korean, a weapon with a long and distinguished history in East Asian warfare, was a standard part of any Goryeo fortress garrison's equipment. Unlike the composite bow, which required years of training to use effectively and considerable physical strength to draw at full combat tempo over extended periods, the crossbow was a mechanical device that could be loaded and fired by soldiers of varying physical conditioning, and that could be preloaded and held ready for an extended time without the muscular fatigue that maintaining a drawn bow imposed. In the dense, close-quarters environment of a wall under assault, where targets presented themselves suddenly and at short range, the crossbow gave defenders the ability to deliver accurate, high-energy shots with minimal exposure above the parapet. Firing positions built into the wall design, arrow loops, crenellations, protected bastions projecting forward from the wall face, allowed crossbow operators to engage attackers approaching the walls from multiple angles while remaining partially protected from return fire. The Korean composite bow itself, the gakgung, a recurved bow of exceptional power made from laminated horn, wood, and sinew, was one of the finest missile weapons of the medieval period anywhere on Earth. Korean archers had been developing their tradition for centuries, and in the context of the Kuju garrison, the archers positioned on the wall top represented a concentrated zone of ranged fire superiority over the attackers below. An arrow fired from a height of 8 to 10 meters carries significantly more energy at impact than one fired on a flat trajectory, and from the elevated position of the walls, Korean archers could engage targets that Mongol archers on level ground could not effectively suppress. During the approach of assault formations, when Mongol commanders needed their infantry to cross open ground between the siege lines and the walls, concentrated archery fire from the ramparts imposed casualties on those infantry during their most vulnerable moment, moving in the open, under load, without the ability to effectively return fire against elevated, protected shooters. This was not a passive defence. It was an active killing zone that the defenders managed and maintained, and that the Mongols had to pay a price in blood to cross on every single assault across 30 days. The fire carts that the Mongols pushed against the wooden gates of Kuju deserve separate attention, because the gate represented the single, most structurally vulnerable point in any fortress circuit. Stone walls could absorb enormous amounts of punishment. Wooden gates, however, reinforced with iron, were combustible, and a sustained fire cart assault against a gate, keeping burning material in contact with the wood long enough to charcoal and weaken it, could eventually create the breach that a battering ram or a concentrated infantry assault could exploit. At Kuju, this tactic was deployed. The Mongols pushed their fire carts against the gates. The defenders responded with suppressive fire from the gate towers above, the projecting bastions specifically designed to allow defenders to shoot downward along the face of the gate, and with counter-fire materials designed to extinguish or displace the burning carts before they could do irreversible damage to the gate structure. The specific materials used included wet clay and mud as insulating barriers packed against the lower face of the gates from the inside, and water poured from above through specifically designed openings in the gate tower floors. The gate held. In every assault across 30 days, the gate held. This brings us to something that is easy to overlook in the drama of the assault weapons and the HELLFIRE countermeasures, the supply problem. Park Seo's defensive doctrine was extraordinarily material-intensive. Molten iron requires iron ore or recycled iron stock, working forges and fuel for those forges. Burning mud and fire suppression compounds require stockpiles of their component materials. Arrows require continued availability or production capacity. Food and water for the garrison require pre-stocked granaries, and either a water source inside the walls or stored reserves. The fact that Park Seo was able to sustain the full range of these defensive measures for 30 consecutive days of assault tells us that his preparation before the siege began was as important as his tactical responses during it. He did not simply wait for the Mongols to arrive and then improvise. He planned. He stockpiled. He calculated forward, thinking through the full duration of a siege, estimating how much of each material a garrison would consume at combat tempo over an extended period, and ensuring those materials were available. This kind of logistical foresight is the unglamorous foundation on which every heroic last stand in history is actually built. The romance of the desperate defense obscures the hard work of preparation that made it possible. At Kuju, Park Seo had done that work, and the Mongols were paying for his preparation every day that passed. Every assault repelled was not just a tactical failure for Sartaq, it was a subtraction from his operational capacity. His assault troops, thrown against the walls again and again, were taking casualties each time. Catapult crews and sapper teams, killed or wounded by active countermeasures, were not easily replaced in the field. The engineering equipment itself, towers damaged or destroyed by molten iron and fire, tunnels collapsed by countermining operations, catapult frames cracked by overuse or damaged by sortie raids, required materials and labour to repair or replace. The Mongol army was enormous compared to Park Seo's garrison, but it was not infinite. It was an expeditionary force, operating at the far end of a supply chain that stretched back across the Yalu River. Every day it spent at Kuju was a day it was not moving south, not pressing its operational advantage against the rest of a kingdom already nearly on its knees, not completing the conquest that Ogedai Khan had dispatched it to execute. The Siege of Kuju was costing Sartaq not just blood but time, and in military operations, time spent where you do not want to be is a compound cost that grows heavier the longer you pay it. By the midpoint of the siege, Sartaq had already exhausted the full standard sequence of Mongol siege doctrine: catapult bombardment insufficient, assault towers defeated, sapper tunnels found and destroyed, fire carts against the gates extinguished, mass infantry assault with scaling ladders thrown back, fire bombs absorbed. And still the walls of Kuju stood, and still the flag of Goryeo flew above the ramparts, and still General Park Seo walked the wall, commanding, organising, maintaining the operational discipline of a garrison that by any conventional measure should have broken days ago. By now the siege had already stopped looking like a routine Mongol operation and had become something harder to explain. As the second half of the siege ground forward, even the most experienced officers in Sartaq's command were being forced to confront a possibility they had almost certainly never seriously entertained before arriving at Kuju, that this fortress might not fall. But Sartaq was not ready to accept that conclusion. Not yet. He had one more full escalation to attempt. He was going to intensify every axis of attack simultaneously: catapults, towers, tunnels, infantry assaults and fire weapons, all at once, all concentrated, all relentlessly sustained, and drive the garrison past whatever reserve of will it still possessed. He was going to break the walls, or he was going to break the men behind them. He had an army counted by some traditions in the tens of thousands. He had enormous patience. He had one of the most technically sophisticated siege apparatuses in the world. And Park Seo had 300 men, a set of walls, and fire. One final moment before we get to the end. If the courage, the discipline, and the unbreakable will we have been talking about in this episode speaks to you, if you believe that the spirit of those who refuse to yield deserves to be carried forward, then head to our store in the description below. We carry shirts that speak that language. The phalanx, Mollen Labe, the Anabasis route, the Battle of Salamis. These are not just designs. They are statements. They are a way of wearing history and everything it means. Every purchase directly supports this channel and keeps these stories being told. Link is in the description. Now, back to Kuju, because in Act 4, the unbreakable will of roughly 300 defenders is about to force one of Ogedai Khan's senior commanders to do something Mongol armies almost never wanted to do. There is a concept in military history that theorists and commanders have wrestled with across centuries, across cultures, across every form of warfare from the ancient world to the modern age. A concept that sits at the intersection of psychology, logistics, and pure human stubbornness, and that resists clean definition precisely because it is not reducible to numbers, or technology, or doctrine. That concept is the breaking point. Every army has one. Every fortress garrison has one. The entire logic of siege warfare, the reason sieges were prosecuted at all, the reason commanders invested weeks and months and thousands of men in the grinding, expensive, unglamorous work of investing a city and battering at its walls, rested on the assumption that the breaking point existed and that it could be reached. That somewhere on the other side of enough days, enough bombardment, enough casualties, enough starvation, enough sleeplessness, enough fire and blood and stone, the defenders would crack. Not necessarily because they ran out of walls or weapons, but because they ran out of will. The entire history of the Mongol Empire's siege campaigns was built on this assumption, and across 2 decades of campaigning that had broken some of the most heavily fortified and most determinedly defended cities in the world, the assumption had proven correct every single time. The Jin capital at Zhongdu held for years before it fell. The great cities of the Khwarezmid Empire held for months before the walls gave way. Persian, Chinese, Jurchen, Tangut, commander after commander, garrison after garrison, had eventually reached that breaking point and either surrendered or been exterminated. The Mongols had rarely found a fortress that could absorb their full system of pressure and still refused to break. Rarely found a garrison whose will could outlast the momentum of the Mongol war machine long enough to force a strategic choice, until Kuju. And here is where the story stops being simply a military history and becomes something else entirely, something that touches the question of what human beings are actually capable of when they have decided, at the deepest level of personal conviction, that they will not yield. 300 men. Or close to it. The historical sources are consistent that the garrison was desperately small, drawn from whatever soldiers had found their way to Kuju's gates before Sartaq closed the net around it. 300 men against a force that historians estimate in the tens of thousands, against the full weight of the most sophisticated military apparatus the medieval world had ever produced, against an enemy who had broken everything that had ever stood before it. And on the morning after the 30th day of siege, the walls of Kuju were still standing. To understand what 30 days of continuous siege assault actually meant in human terms for the men inside those walls, you have to think beyond the combat. Think about the nights, after each day of assault, after each round of catapult stones hammering the walls, after each tower advance and hand-to-hand repulse at the ramparts, after each sapper tunnel discovered and destroyed, after each firebomb absorbed and countered. The garrison had to remain at combat readiness through the night too. Because the Mongols did not stop at nightfall, they could not afford to stop. Nighttime offered opportunities that daylight denied. Cover for sapper work, cover for probing attacks designed to find gaps in the defensive watch rotation, cover for moving assault equipment into forward positions that would be used in the morning's main effort. The defenders therefore maintained watch rotations around the full circuit of the walls through every night of those 30 days. That means Park Seo's 300 were not sleeping for 8 hours and then fighting for 16. They were snatching sleep in rotation, in short intervals behind walls that were being struck by catapult fire even in the dark, in conditions of cold and smoke and the constant sound of military activity outside their walls. Sleep deprivation at this level does not simply make men tired, it degrades every cognitive and physical function they possess. It makes wounds heal more slowly. It makes decisions slower and less reliable. It makes men see things that are not there and miss things that are. The garrison of Kuju was fighting this battle not just against the Mongols, but against their own disintegrating physical condition, and they were winning that battle too, not by transcending biology, but by maintaining sufficient organizational discipline that even severely degraded soldiers could be placed where they needed to be, and given a task simple enough to execute. That organizational discipline came from Park Seo, and it came too from the structure of command he had built inside the fortress. Kim Chungon holding the eastern and western walls, Kim Kyongsun on the southern wall, each commander responsible for his sector, each empowered to make tactical decisions at the point of contact without waiting for orders from the center, because in the chaos of a simultaneous multi-point assault, centralized decision-making is a fatal liability. By the time an order travels from the center to the point of need, the situation has already changed. Park Seo had distributed authority intelligently, keeping strategic command centralized in himself while pushing tactical authority downward to the commanders who could see what was happening at their section of wall with their own eyes. This is not a revolutionary concept in the abstract, but it was far from universal in the medieval world, and at Kuju it was a critical enabler of the garrison's ability to respond to simultaneous crises faster than the attackers could press them. Through the second half of the siege, after Sartaq had cycled through the full standard sequence of Mongol siege doctrine and found each avenue blocked, the character of the assault began to shift. The methodical, phased approach of the early siege gave way to something more desperate and more expensive. Sartaq began pressing simultaneous assaults on multiple wall sections rather than concentrating at a single point, an acknowledgement that the concentrated approach was not producing the breach he needed, and that perhaps overwhelming the defender's capacity to respond by attacking everywhere at once would create the chaos that individual attacks had not. This was a logical escalation. It was also a costly one. Attacking on multiple axes simultaneously required more infantry in the assault simultaneously, which meant more casualties simultaneously when each assault was beaten back. The Mongol loss rate, which had been significant from the first day of the siege, accelerated as the assaults intensified, and the Mongol soldiers were not automatons. They were human beings with the same psychological limits as any soldiers in any war. Repeated assault on a defended position, walking across open ground into concentrated fire, watching the men beside you fall, reaching the wall only to be met with molten iron and burning compounds, and crossbow bolts from protected positions above, being driven back, forming up and being sent forward again, erodes fighting will at an accelerating rate. A soldier can absorb this cycle a certain number of times before the fundamental human survival instinct begins to override military discipline and training. The officers of the Mongol assault formations were experienced professionals who knew how to push men forward, but they were pushing men who had been failing at this same task for 30 days, and failure, repeated bloody, physically terrifying failure, has an accumulative effect on human psychology that no amount of military discipline entirely negates. The assault infantry at Kuju, by the final week of the siege, were attacking a fortress they had attacked dozens of times before and failed to take. They knew what waited at the walls. They knew what had happened to the men who had gone up those ladders before them and not come back down. And they were being asked to go again. Sartaq was running out of options. And now a specific moment, recorded in the historical sources of this siege with a vividness that 790 years have not dimmed, arrived to force him to confront that reality. The old Mongol general came to the walls. He's described in the sources as a man of over 70 years, an extraordinary age for a combat veteran of the Mongol campaigns, who had been with the army since his boyhood, since the time when young men on the steppes braided their hair in the fashion of his youth. He had followed the army through the unification wars, through the campaigns against the Tangut-Xia, through the grinding assault on the Jin dynasty, through engagements against peoples and fortifications whose names filled pages of military records. He had seen more sieges than most men see years. He had watched cities fall that their defenders had been certain could never fall. He had absorbed, across 7 decades of military life, a comprehensive education in the full range of what human beings were capable of doing to each other in the pursuit of conquest and resistance. He was not a man who was easily impressed. He was not a man who had much left to surprise him. He walked to the walls of Kuju. He looked up at the ramparts where the defenders still stood. He looked at the ground around him, the craters from Mongol stones that had been deflected or fallen short, the scorched earth where fire had been used, the disturbed soil where sapper tunnels had been dug and collapsed. He inspected the siege works, the damage to Mongol equipment, the positions from which the defenders had operated their countermeasures. He assessed what he saw with the cold, professional eye of a man who had spent a lifetime doing exactly this kind of battlefield evaluation. And then he said it. The words that the historical record preserved, the words that the chronicle tradition preserves with striking specificity. I have followed the army since I was a boy, and I have grown accustomed to seeing cities of the land undergo attack and become the scene of battle. Yet I have never seen a city undergo an assault like this and in the end not surrender. The tradition even preserves his sigh before the words. He sighed. A man of 70 years who had seen everything, who thought he had seen everything, and who had arrived at the walls of Kuju and discovered that he had not. That somewhere in the world, in this small fortress city on the Korean Peninsula, there was something that his entire lifetime of military experience had not prepared him to encounter. A garrison that simply would not break. The psychological weight of that moment, for Sartaq, for the officers who heard it, for the assault infantry who would have learned of it through the networks of military rumour and camp conversation that carry such things at the speed of fire, cannot be overstated. When a 70-year veteran of the army that broke everything looks at your target and expresses open, undisguised astonishment that it has not broken, something shifts in the command climate. The certainty of eventual success, the baseline assumption that had underpinned every decision Sartaq had made since the siege began, was no longer certain. It was, for the first time, genuinely questionable. And questionable certainty in a military commander is a slow-acting poison. It does not necessarily produce immediate paralysis, but it changes the quality of the decisions that follow. Sartaq pressed on. He was a professional. He was the commander of Ogedai Khan's invasion force with specific objectives and a strategic timeline that the Siege of Kuju had already disrupted far beyond acceptable limits. He could not simply leave without making every conceivable final effort. The assaults continued. The machines were repaired and redeployed. The infantry were reorganized and committed again. And again, Park Seo's garrison met them at the walls and drove them back. The 30th day passed, then beyond it, and then, at some point in that terrible arithmetic of assault and repulse, of casualties mounting on both sides, of machines wearing out and men wearing down, Sartaq made his calculation. The calculation was not emotional. That is important to understand. Sartaq was not defeated by admiration for his enemy, however genuine that admiration may have been. He was defeated by the mathematics of attrition and strategic opportunity cost. The Mongol force that had arrived at Kuju with the operational momentum of a conquered northern Goryeo behind it was no longer the same force in operational terms. Its assault infantry had absorbed casualties across 30 days of failed attacks. Its engineering equipment had been damaged and partially destroyed. Its supply situation, at the end of a line that stretched back across the Yalu River, was under increasing strain. And most critically, Kuju was not the objective. Korea was the objective. The capital at Kaesong was the objective. The submission of the Goryeo Kingdom and the installation of Mongol administrative control over the peninsula was the objective. Sartaq had already achieved substantial progress toward that objective. Northern Goryeo was devastated. The Goryeo court was in negotiations and Mongol forces were already pressing toward the capital from multiple directions. Kuju was a fortress on the route south that he had failed to take. But the war did not require him to take it. The war required him to win Korea. And he could win Korea without Kuju, provided he accepted the loss, extracted his force from the siege lines, and redirected his operational energy toward the objectives that were still within reach. He lifted the siege. The Mongol army withdrew from Kuju. The engines were broken down or abandoned. The troops marched away from the walls that had held them for over a month. And inside those walls, behind the battered but unbroken ramparts, General Park Seo and his garrison were still standing. This moment, the lifting of the siege, was recorded in Korean historical sources with the gravity it deserved. It was not celebrated in the raucous, triumphant way that a decisive battlefield victory might have been, because the situation beyond Kuju's walls was not celebratory. Northern Goryeo was devastated. Mongol forces were still pressing toward the capital. The Goryeo court was already deep in negotiations for a peace that would acknowledge Mongol supremacy. The victory at Kuju was real and extraordinary, but it existed within a larger context of strategic catastrophe for the kingdom. The kingdom had not won the war. It was losing the war. Kuju had simply declined to participate in the losing. The peace negotiations concluded with Goryeo agreeing to submit to nominal Mongol suzerainty, acknowledging Ogedai Khan as overlord, agreeing to provide tribute, and accepting the placement of reportedly 72 Mongol administrative officials called Daragachi in various towns and cities across the kingdom. Sartaq's main force withdrew northward across the Yalu in the spring of 1232 AD, leaving these administrators behind as the visible symbols of Mongol dominance. From a purely political standpoint, the Mongols had achieved enough of what they came for to declare the campaign a success, and then came the reckoning for Park Seo. The Goryeo court, in the process of formalizing peace with the Mongols, faced a specific and deeply uncomfortable problem. Park Seo and Choi Chun-myong, the commander who had defended the city of Chaju with similar tenacity, had held their fortresses in defiance of both the Mongols and eventually the explicit orders of the Goryeo court itself, which had issued instructions for fortress commanders to stand down and submit as part of the peace process. Park Seo had refused even those orders. He had held Kuju not just against the Mongols but against his own king's command. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval Korean military politics, and particularly under the iron-fisted rule of Choyu's military government, this was an act of insubordination that could not be easily overlooked. The Mongols, for their part, demanded accountability. These two men had killed thousands of their soldiers and held their army at bay for a month. Justice, from the Mongol perspective, should have been simple. Park Seo was brought before his captors. He stood at the edge of execution. The historical sources are unambiguous on this point. He had defied the greatest military power on earth for 30 days and forced their withdrawal, and his reward was to kneel before that same power's judgment and wait to learn whether he would live or die. He lived. The Mongols spared him. They spared Choi Chun-myong too, and the reason they gave, preserved in the historical record across multiple source traditions, was the one that towers above every other detail of this story in its extraordinary nature. They spared him because of his courage, because even the Mongols, the conquerors of half the world, the army that had obliterated civilizations and executed kings and generals without hesitation, found in what Park Seo had done something they could not extinguish with a sword without diminishing themselves in the act. They admired him. The men who had thrown everything at Kuju's walls and been turned back day after day for 30 days, those men looked at the commander who had done it to them and felt not hatred but something closer to reverence. This is one of the most remarkable moments in the entire history of the Mongol Empire, an empire built on absolute power, on the total annihilation of resistance, on the message that defiance ends in death, that empire spared a man because his defiance had been too extraordinary to punish. It would have been a kind of desecration. You do not execute a man like that. You acknowledge him. Kuju would eventually submit to Mongol authority in 1232 AD, after repeated demands from the Goryeo court that had by then formalized its submission. The fortress that had held for 30 days against the full Mongol war machine opened its gates in peace, not in defeat. Park Seo walked out of it alive, and Sartaq, the general who had lifted the siege, who had turned away from walls he could not break, would meet his own end at the Battle of Cheonan on December 16th, 1232 AD, credited in the Goryeo as having been struck by an arrow fired by the monk Kim Yun-hoo during the second Mongol invasion of Korea. He had survived the walls of Kuju. He did not survive the second time he came to Korea. The broader sweep of the Mongol invasions of Korea continued for decades. Ögedei Khan sent further armies. The Goryeo military government under Choeyu refused to maintain the terms of submission and relocated the royal court to the island of Ganghwa in 1232 AD, a move specifically designed to exploit the one military vulnerability the Mongols had never solved: their deep institutional discomfort with naval operations. The Mongols could cross continents on horseback. They could not easily cross the narrow but treacherous strait between the Korean mainland and Ganghwa Island, and the Goryeo court remained there, technically unconquered, for 28 years, while the Mongol invasions continued to devastate the mainland. 6 major Mongol invasion campaigns followed between 1232 and 1259 AD. The suffering they caused to the Korean civilian population was staggering in its scale. Towns burned, populations enslaved, agricultural land devastated. The Korean people paid an enormous price for the resistance their military government chose to maintain. But Kuju was never replicated, not by the Mongols and not by anyone who came after them. What Park Seo and his garrison achieved in those 30 days in the autumn of 1231 AD, holding those walls, defeating every tool in the most sophisticated siege arsenal the medieval world had ever assembled, maintaining the will and discipline and organizational coherence of a force so outnumbered as to defy military logic, stands alone. Not because there were no other heroic defences in the long history of Mongol warfare against Korea. There were many. The Koreans fought the Mongols with extraordinary persistence across nearly 3 decades of intermittent war. But none of the other defences combined the specific elements that made Kuju so remarkable: the genius of preparation, the ingenuity of countermeasures, the absolute operational effectiveness of a garrison that should have been overwhelmed on the first day, and instead held for 30, into a single sustained achievement that forced a senior Mongol commander of the 13th century to turn around and walk away. A few hundred corps defenders, a Mongol force counted by some traditions in the tens of thousands, 30 days, and when the accounting was done, it was not the walls that had broken. It was not the will of the garrison that had cracked. It was the mathematics of Sartaq's operational calculation that had, finally, yielded to the one thing the Mongol system could never fully account for: the decision of a single man to hold, no matter what came over those walls, until there was nothing left on the other side willing to keep coming. That man was General Park Seo, and this was the siege that forced the Mongols to turn away. History does not always remember the people it should. The great conquerors fill the pages, their names attached to empires, to battles, to chapters in textbooks that begin with their victories and end with their deaths. But the defenders, the ones who held, who refused, who took the full weight of the world's most powerful war machines against their walls and did not yield, Those people disappear into footnotes, into the margins, into stories that almost no one outside their own culture has ever heard. General Park Seo is one of those people. He did not conquer anything. He did not expand a kingdom or build an empire or leave his name on a dynasty. He held a fortress for 30 days in a war his kingdom was losing. He held it so effectively, so ingeniously, so stubbornly, that the army that had defeated the Jin dynasty and destroyed the Khwarezmid Empire looked at his walls and turned around. He was nearly executed for it. He was spared because even his enemies could not bring themselves to destroy something that extraordinary. That is the brutal truth of war. It is not only about who wins, it is about what people are willing to endure and why. It is about the mathematics of will against power and the rare, astonishing moments when will wins. Park Seo won, and 800 years later we're still telling his story. If this episode meant something to you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told, researched properly, and brought to life for the world, then consider joining the Wars in History YouTube membership. Starting at just $2.99 a month, your membership directly funds the research, the production, and everything that goes into making episodes like this one. Every member is a reason this channel keeps going. Every contribution means another story, another general, another siege, another battle that history almost forgot gets told. The link is right below this video. Join us, be part of keeping these stories alive, and until next time, this is Wars in History. Stay curious, stay relentless,